Dear speakers and participants, I think it is sharp 12 o'clock. I welcome you to our webinar, Migration and the European Union, Multi-Level Governance as a Solution, organized by the Committee of Regions together with the European Parliamentary Research Service and the Austrian Institute of Federalism, which I am representing. I'm Peter Bussjäger, head of the Institute. I thank all partners for their excellent cooperation. As we have a very tight time limit, I will not leave too many words with the introduction, but I have to give you some information on organizational details of this event. Please note this practical information. To see automatic English subtitles, please click on the three dots here and then click on live captions and you have the subtitles. Everyone except for the speakers has their audios and videos automatically disabled as the limit time does not allow for spontaneous interventions from the audience. You can use the chat function. In this chat, you can interact, post your comments. It's very welcome, and ask questions. If the time does not allow us to answer to the questions, we will try to respond to them after the webinar in a follow-up document published on our website. The meeting will be recorded and available for viewing on the website of the Committee of Regions later. According to the program, the first speaker is Mr. Othmar Karas. Othmar Karas has been Vice President of the European Parliament from 2014 to 2016 and held this position again since 2019. Since 1999, and thus for more than 20 years, he has been a member of the European Parliament. In October 2020, he has been also announced as Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Fiscal Affairs of the European Parliament. Othmar Karas held numerous political functions at EU level. However, it is not possible to mention them all. He is also in Austria a very well-known political person. We are extremely pleased that he agreed to give us a keynote speech today. Unfortunately, due to an unforeseen event, he cannot be present in person, but he has sent us a video message. And I would now ask the technical support to start with the video message of Mr. Karas.
Ladies and gentlemen, meine Damen und Herren, liebe Freundinnen und Freunde, first, thank you for organizing this webinar now. Today's event could not have been timelier. Migration has long been on the European agenda. Since last September, we have had the new Pact on Migration and Asylum with a series of legislative proposals. Divergences abound. Difficulties are numerous. Progress is limited. Against this backdrop, in just 1 week, the European Council will have migration on its agenda. So, today's event could not have been timelier. Second, I have just mentioned the difficulties. Ladies and gentlemen, let me be frank. These difficulties amount sometimes to a deadlock. On migration, the debate has become so divisive. What we need now is an informed discussion, an academic debate. We need to find solutions on migration, and this conference has the audacity to make migration rhyme with European Union, as well as with solution. Let me read this ambitious title again. Migration in the European Union, multi-level governance as a solution. So, lieber Dr. Speich, lieber Christian Xodam, my warmest thanks to you for organizing this webinar. Today, as an opening to our exchange, I would like to share 3 thoughts with you. First, new trends. Second, a new approach. And third, new hope. Let me start with the new trends. How do migrants enter Europe? They are taking new routes. A few years ago, it was via the Eastern Mediterranean, then the Central Mediterranean, from Libya to Italy, and now the Western Mediterranean from Morocco to Spain. To understand this situation and adopt the best solutions, we need to keep up to date with these new trends. This goes for other trends too. How do migrants affect Europe's demography? What impact have they on unemployment? As Vice President of the European Parliament, responsible for the Parliamentary Research Service, I am glad we have the independent and objective information we need to do our work. After the new trends, let me share my contribution to a new approach to migration. Migration has always been, at its core, a human rights issue. Migration is a fundamental rights issue. The fundamental rights of all individuals must be respected everywhere, including in reception and identification centers. Now, ladies and gentlemen, is it the case? Are fundamental rights being respected in these centers? It is not for me to answer this question. It is for the Fundamental Rights Agency, our European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, based in Vienna. Here is my contribution to a new approach. I am calling for a representative of the Fundamental Rights Agency to be associated with each of these centers. If European money goes to these centers, then the Fundamental Rights Agency should go to these centers too. And finally, after the new trends and the new approach, let me turn to now hope. To find a solution to the challenge of migration, we need to address the fundamental question of decision making in Europe. We need to give the European Union the power it needs. The power it needs in social affairs, the power it needs in external affairs, to adopt an Africa strategy of the European Union, to power it needs to address the geopolitical routes of migration. And for this, what better moment than the Conference on the Future of Europe? This conference needs to address the institutional issue of decision making. The Conference on the Future of Europe is one prospect which gives me hope. Ladies and gentlemen, meine Damen und Herren, to make migration rhyme with solution, we don't need a partisan debate. We need an informed discussion. We need an academic discussion. I look forward to your various contributions, and I wish you a most fruitful event today. Thank you. Vielen Dank.
We thank Mr. Kallas for sharing with us his 3 thoughts on migration in Europe. And we now come to the next speaker, Mr. Mark Speich. Since 2017, Mr. Speich is the Secretary of State for Federal, European and International Affairs of North Rhine-Westphalia. He also holds the chair of Commission for Citizenship, Governance, Institutional and External Affairs of the European Committee of the Regions. And Mr. Vice President, the floor is yours now. I would ask you to your statement.
Sehr geehrter Herr Professor Bussjäger, distinguished guests, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, I'm very delighted to be invited to this webinar today. And I can only agree with Ottmar Karas' comment that this webinar comes at exactly the right time. And I'm very grateful also to Christian Xodam for taking the initiative, for this very important initiative. I'm very glad about that. All our panelists today are experts in their field and have been critically reflecting on the current system of migration management. Their objective is to improve that system both for the benefit of migrants and for the benefit of our societies. The result must be that migration is managed in an effective and humane way, fully in line with our European values, as Othmar Karas has, well, said so determined, and I really welcome that. The common European asylum system is facing major challenges, and we all know that. The new pact on migration and asylum and its multiple proposals presented by the European Commission are aimed at addressing these pressing issues. The local and regional authorities have expressed their concern with regard to the pact in the opinion of the European Committee of the Regions. Rapporteur was Ms. Antje Grother, the Vice President of the Bremen City Parliament and member of our Civics Commission. The members of the European Committee of the Regions support the Commission's objective of developing a comprehensive system for managing migration in the long term, based on the values of solidarity and dignity and in line with EU and international law. However, our members are concerned that the local and regional dimension has not been sufficiently taken into account in the new pact. They point out that a successful crisis management begins at local and regional level, and that coordination with local and regional authorities should be a top priority. With regard to border procedures, it is important to take due account of the needs of the competent local and regional authorities and to consult them beforehand. Recently, there have been discussions about the rather unclear definition of migratory pressure in the pact. Even if some migration movements do not affect the entire national asylum system, there may still be regions under particular pressure, and these are at risk of being overwhelmed. Therefore, the definition we propose refers also to situations at local and regional level and not only at member states level. Due to time concerns, I will not go into more recommendations on the asylum system reform, but regarding integration of migrants, I would like to stress that many local and regional authorities across the EU are willing to be actively involved. In this context, the Committee of Regions has established a network of cities and regions for integration of migrants. This network is bringing together more than 150 regions and cities to exchange best practice. So it's a very practical network. It's not a kind of theoretical endeavor that is taking place here. The network helps spread a more constructive and positive narrative on migration and integration. Under the recently concluded partnership with the European Commission, we hope that even more cities and regions will be able to benefit from the capacity building activities of this network. Finally, I would like to make the link to multi-level governance, which is the core theme of this webinar. I share the view of the authors of the publication which is presented today. Multi-level governance is key to finding a holistic approach to migration management. At all levels of government, we have a duty to fulfill the legitimate expectations of the citizens. We know that these expectations of citizens include orderly and legal migration, reliable law enforcement, and effective human rights protection for refugees and those in need. At the same time, however, the European citizens expect their free movement rights under Schengen to be protected and not be entangled in the complex Dublin rules and the rules on economic immigration to the EU. It is my belief that we can advance on these issues if we balance and apply correctly the concept of reciprocal rights and obligations as guided by our values. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I look forward now to the contributions from the distinguished speakers. Thank you so much, and once again for the initiative of this webinar.
Thank you, Mr. Speich, for your important statement to this topic. Thank you for emphasizing the role of the regions and municipalities in migration management. And you have mentioned the term multi-level governance, and you have mentioned that the role of Christian Xodam in inspiring this publication and this webinar. And so I come to the next step of our program, to the introduction of the debate. And in this context, I would again like to thank Mr. Xodam for the idea of publishing a book that looks at migration and integration from a variety of perspectives, from the European level and what needs to be done on the European level, to the distribution of competences between the Union member states and regions, to the challenges of practice in asylum law, integration efforts at the regional level, the impact, for example, of migration on spatial planning, the role of religion, and to the specific challenges for cities, for example. These are only examples of the contributions to the topic united in our publication. Migration and the European Union multi-level governance as a solution. What means multi-level governance in this context? From my point of view, I come to this, what Mr. Speich said, it is essential to underline that migration and integration are closely connected agendas, although the two terms are clearly different. When we talk on the juridical aspects of migration, we have in mind that migration law means the regulation of international migration, the allowance of immigration and residence. Integration is a more complex term, meaning access to citizenship, a topic presently controversial, discussed in Austria. For example, electoral rights, participation rights, language acquisition, education, labor market, and healthcare. For example, we hear from experts that the corona crisis complicates the integration and economic position of migrants in the trend. And that's also an aspect we should have to bear in mind. Migration and integration as policy areas are typical examples for multi-level governance. The tasks linked to these policies cannot be assigned to one level of decision-making alone, but require coherent and coordinated interaction between local, regional, national, European, and international levels. Both policies areas, migration and integration, are closely connected, as I have said before. The complex network of the distribution of European and national competences and regional competences merely establishes the framework conditions. Union legislation is proving to be particularly reticent towards third country nationals. It is the task of local, regional, and national actors to enable integration. This requires not only legal regulations, but also active action on the part of all levels involved. The constitutional state plays an important role in this context too, independently whether it is organized as a unitary state or has decentralized legislative bodies. The EU must therefore not only negotiate migration policy between member states and the Union, regions and local authorities have to be actively involved and consulted, in particular on the issue of EU internal borders. In view of the upcoming conference on the future of Europe, I would not advocate a strong expansion of the Union's competences. For me, such an expansion would be possible in the area of asylum seekers. However, I would like to emphasize the need of cooperation, good governance in this area, and the responsible performance of tasks by the member states, regions, and municipalities when it comes to integration. Now, we are looking forward with interest to the statement of Professor Anton Belinka. He's one of the most well-known political scientists in Austria, and he has published numerous scientific articles on a wide range of topics. We are very pleased that Mr. Belinka, who taught about 30 years at the University of Innsbruck and then at the Central European University in Budapest and then Vienna, is ready to make a statement on this topic, and he has also contributed to our publication. Mr. Anton Belinka, I would like to ask you for your statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this conference. My approach is the approach of a political scientist, which is especially doing research and teaching in the field of comparative politics. From the viewpoint of comparative politics, the European Union must be considered a special case, a system somewhere between a federation and a confederation. The EU is less than the United States of Europe, but more than a loose structure which allows sovereign states and their representatives to meet and discuss and looking for unanimous decisions. The EU can be called an unfinished federation. In some political fields, the EU is a federation, especially as a monetary union guided by a central bank, the European Bank, but first and foremost by the single European market, which creates the union's, again, still unfinished federal structure. In Poland, Portuguese citizens enjoy the 4 freedoms of the single market, as do Danish citizens in Italy. All they are entitled to live and to study and work and invest and establish businesses without having to ask for special permission. With the exception of some political rights, especially voting on the national level, Romanian citizens are not foreigners in Belgium, neither are Lithuanians foreigners in Ireland. They all are European citizens. The European Union's special status between federation and confederation creates ambivalences and contradictions. This is especially evident in all matters concerning citizenship rights and all matters of immigration. To provide an immigrant or refugee from Afghanistan coming to Greece with Greek citizenship is up to Greek law, implemented by the Greek administration. To provide a citizen from the Russian Federation with a Maltese passport is in the competence and in the power of the government of Malta. But both the new Greek and the new Maltese citizen are entitled to enjoy all the freedoms of the European single market, may it be in Slovenia or in the Netherlands. That means access to the most federalized European structure, the single market, is still completely controlled by the member states. National sovereignty meets an unfinished federation and demonstrates that the Union is still not developed enough. This contradiction resides in the imbalance or almost non-existence of a European immigration policy. Member states located on the European Union's external borders have to face a challenge without an assistance of other European states, without the help of an all-European solidarity. When it comes to immigration, the promise of deepening the European integration is still unfinished. National egoism prevents a common European immigration policy. We all know the consequence of this contradiction. The humanitarian catastrophe on Greek islands and the corruption of selling European passports by national governments. We all know what should be done. Integration, meaning a policy and shifting decision-making power from the national to the European level. It should be up to the Union to decide who gets access to the single market by acquiring European citizenship. But we all know why this has not been possible yet. National interests beat European interests. It should be up to the Union to define and implement the criteria of European citizenship. It is a contradiction to have a European passport, but the access to the European passport is not controlled by the European Union. The European Union sometimes is called, I think rightfully, an economic giant, but a political dwarf. To set the Union's political potential free means the promise of a common foreign and security policy must become reality, but to save the precondition of the Union's economic powerhouse role, the single market must be defended against national egoisms which want to profit from the single market on the basic freedoms of the single market, but which prevent the common European migration policy, which is the logical consequence of the European single market. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, and I hope I could prevent some ideas for the following discussion.
Thank you, Anton Peleca, for drawing our attention to the unfinished union and unfinished federation. Thank you for your contribution.
Isabel Ioannidis is joining us from the EPRS. So, please.
Yes, hi everyone, and thank you very much for your kind invitation. I'm so glad to be able to contribute to today's topical discussion and I'll speak on the external dimensions of migration and hopefully complement what was just mentioned by Professor Pelinka. The Vice President, I'm glad, has already mentioned the importance of the geopolitical dynamics surrounding migration pressures, especially in the Mediterranean, but also more broadly. So in the 5 minutes that I have at my disposal, I'll try and make 5 short points. I will probably start with my most controversial one, to say that we need to remember that migration is a security problem and a destabilizing force, first and foremost in our own neighborhood, in the countries surrounding us. And I'm thinking in particular of Lebanon, where the Lebanese people are increasingly desperate amid the political deadlock, the financial meltdown, the rising poverty, the consequences of that massive blast that we also on our television sets at port of Beirut. And also they have also been suffering from the COVID-19 pandemic. So this country is at the brink of collapse, and it is also a country that hosts, according to the UNHCR's reports, over 850,000 registered refugees from Syria, and in addition has overall a community of Syrians living there of 1.5 million. And that is in addition to the Palestinian refugees who live there. And why am I mentioning this? Because the situation is desperate enough for the Lebanese, but it's even more desperate and difficult for these refugees who, according to the UNHCR again, 90% of the Syrian refugees' households are under the extreme poverty line, which is up 55% from early 2019. And honestly, we also need to mention Turkey. I know the EU helps a lot Turkey with different programs, and we have the agreement and the special fund, the facility. But we need to remember that Turkey continues to host the largest number of refugees worldwide, as the number of people forcibly displaced across the world due to conflict, violence, and persecution hit record levels. So Turkey today still hosts 3.6 million registered Syrian refugees and almost 350,000 people from other nationalities. My second point is the problem with unfinished peace that we have in our neighborhood. And I'm thinking of fragile situations and conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, and tenuous peace agreements in Libya that can also be a source of migration. So in addition to obviously the continuing civil war in Syria, Iraq remains highly unstable, still dealing with the internal conflict after the US invasion of 2003, US-led invasion, because they were also EU member states, the transnational jihadist Islamic State after 2014, and the continuing sectarian violence and Kurdish separatism. So Iraq is similarly to Lebanon facing an economic implosion that could drive young people into Turkey, looking for opportunities in Europe, therefore compounding political tensions of immigration there as well. And we see that the violence is still quite high in Afghanistan, even though there are ongoing peace talks, but these peace talks are essentially stalled, and this is creating a feeling of despair for people in that country as well, which is also a possible motivation to flee the country. And of course, there's the difficulties faced in maintaining the fragile stability in Libya. Libya is one of the countries we constantly see in the media as having to deal with migrants. The migrant population stocks in Libya are heavily shaped by the geographic proximity and diasporic ties. More than 2/3 of the migrants are from the neighboring countries, especially the Sahel, and especially Niger and Chad, but also Egypt. And it's worth mentioning here that Egypt is one of the 9 countries that are going to experience the biggest increase of population according to forecasts on democratic shifts. So by 2050, it will be among the 9 countries of the world that has the biggest growth of population. And we of course need to take into account the new sources of migration, the new causes of migration, which are the climate change, the conflict for resources because of the climate change, which causes migration, and this we are already seeing very much in the Sahel region. And here, perhaps it's worth again reminding that for the same forecast experts that I just mentioned also say that the population of Africa will double by 2050. So I think increasingly we are going to see that Africa becomes the migration, the pressuring point for migration for Europe. My third point is the expansion of Islamism, because what we have seen actually is that while we were dealing with the jihadists in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we maybe a little bit too, there's too much complacency as to the control that we may have over these two countries. Much of these jihadists have now moved to Africa, and we have seen their action in the Sahel, but they're moving down up to Mozambique. So examining and monitoring and addressing the migration routes that we identify at the EU level, and the Vice President has mentioned them, the Eastern, Central, and Western Mediterranean. It needs to go in full understanding that we live in an interconnected world, and that jihadism is a transnational movement. And therefore, when we analyze our migration routes, we need to do it in a more interlinked manner. The effects and the expansion of this jihadist, of the population living under the jihadist rule, is also a reason for fleeing the oppression. And this is something we saw already in Iraq, when the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant carried out the genocide of the Yazidis in 2014. And it is something that we see today in the Sahel, because the Islamist groups provide basic services to the local populations, basically in areas where the central government, especially in Mali, have lost control of the territories. My fourth point is the issue of globalization and the management of power vacuums. And by here, I mean that obviously there is Europe dealing with these problems around the world through its own peace building capacities and programs, but there are other actors also interested. So there's China and Russia more in the Eastern Mediterranean, China more in Africa. And I have to say, I am a little bit worried about the possible vacuum that could be created by the withdrawal of France from the Sahel and of Barkhane. So something needs to complement that effort, I think, to be able to control the migration.
Isabel, if I may ask you to go a little bit quicker. You have still 2 points, and we have still...
No, I only have 1 point left.
Thank you.
But before going to that last point, I do want to mention Turkey, because I think it's very important in ensuring that we can articulate a strong position and a more positive agenda for cooperation with Turkey, seeing what the migration pressures are from the Eastern Mediterranean. My last concluding point, and since we are at the Committee of Regions, I wanted to mention the regions, of course, because in my field of conflict management and reconstruction, reaching out to the regions and including the rural areas in peace building processes, not only for the reconstruction process, but also for identifying needs and for understanding the dynamic conflicts is an evidence. And these bottom-up approaches are all the more sexy and are constantly being articulated in EU documents. So for me, if the role of the regions is evident in our foreign policy, it is also evident for me that it should play a role in managing the migration flows and needs at the local level within Europe as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ioannidis, for giving us the insights and the factors that cause migration, and excuse my to have missed that the change in the speakers. And now I hand further to Carmen Schmiedle. She's the moderator of the first panel discussion.
Thank you very much. I warmly welcome you to this first panel. As it was announced, my name is Carmen Schmiedle, and I have the pleasure to moderate this panel. We will discuss the topic of migration policy, a question of borders, asylum, economic migration and internal market. On the panel, I welcome Michael Schotter. He's the Director for Migration, Asylum and Visa at DG Home. Martin Hoffmann, Principal Advisor at the International Center for Migration Policy Development. Tobias Molanda, Head of National and International Migration Strategy at the Austrian Federal Ministry of the Interior. And last but not least, Gudrun Biffel from the Danube University Krems in Austria. Given the short amount of time, I've prepared some guiding questions for each speaker. And if time allows, we will maybe be able to take a question from the audience. So please, if you have a question, put it in the chat. In case we don't have time, as we are running a little bit late already, we will make sure the question will be answered afterwards. Dear speakers, please remember to open your mic when I give you the floor. And therefore, I would like to start with Martin. So Martin, together with Michael Spindelecker, you argue in your article in the mentioned book that a pact on asylum and migration can only be achieved if the EU and its member states have to commit to long-term priorities. What are those priorities, and do you see them reflected at the moment?
Carmen, thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First question, like always, can you hear me? Can you see me? Good. So right away, 5 minutes is very short for answering this question, but I will give it my best. I think we always have to start with a look at the baseline, look at the factors that drive migration. This gives us the first answer why the EU needs better responses. The drivers that result in migration will not go away in the future. Conflict, economic imbalances, demographic developments, growing world population, globalization, urbanization, new means of mobility and communication, effects of climate change. All these factors will become more relevant and not less relevant in the future. So the global migration potentials will increase and the EU and its member states will remain extremely attractive destinations. In reality, the most attractive destinations for international migration at the moment and also in the future. It's simply unrealistic to expect that migration pressures or potentials will magically disappear or disappear with a silver bullet solution. The second look we have to take is the look at the overwhelming political relevance the migration issue has in the European debate. First, I want to start with some myth busting. No immigration country or society embraces immigration openly and full-heartedly. All immigration societies are skeptical about immigration. The US, Australia, but also new attractive destinations like South Africa, like Turkey, like Cote d'Ivoire, like North African countries, they all have the debate. And they all have a population that is skeptical about immigration. What is specific about Europe is the significance the European public attaches to the topic. All Eurobarometer surveys confirm that, elections confirm that, Brexit confirms that migration or the solving of the migration issue politically is system relevant, and its migration issue really has the potential to endanger the existence of the European Union. So European leaders, European governments at all levels, European level, state level, regional level, local level, have to find responses that deliver in the eye of the electorates, and that also they have to become better at communicating those responses. So where do we stand at the moment? I think that migration policy, both at the European and the national level, does a lot better than everybody often assumes. It does deliver in many ways, but we tend to solely discuss the areas where it does not deliver. When we look at the instruments, the legal basis, and the policies, we see a tremendous progress over the last 20 years, something that had to be built from scratch and has really matured. But there are important elements missing. And here I see a big problem. I think that the European political systems are caught up in some sort of populist trap. Meanwhile, all parties of the spectrum, not just the traditional populist voices, tend to promise a lot on the rather restrictive side, to put an end to this, put an end to that. And the problem is that they hardly ever deliver. Yes, principally, it would be possible to create the Fortress Europe to reduce unwanted migration to almost zero. but practically it is not possible. There's economic interest, there's free trade interest, there's the wish for unhindered individual mobility, and all this stands against such a full or fully restrictive policy. And that is why I think the EU has to develop a realistic, pragmatic, common, and long-term vision on migration, one that can be delivered, and one that can be also communicated successfully. Now, what are the elements of such a political vision on migration? A start would be to really define realistic goals and to communicate these goals and indicators for achievement. There's many ideas on that: a decrease in irregular arrivals, a decrease in asylum applications, higher return rates, but also goals linked to legal and labor migration, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, one has to work on them. On the internal side, I see a few priorities. The focus should be on much faster, yet legally sound asylum procedures. The long duration of asylum procedures is one of the main arguments for people smugglers to advise their businesses. People can stay very long on the basis of a preliminary permit linked to their asylum procedure. A more credible fight against migrant smuggling and the migrant smuggling culture. A lot can be done there. More credible tackling of illegal foreign employment, especially when it comes to the employers themselves. They're hardly ever sanctioned. And we need credible strategies on labor migration and addressing the effects of demographic change, because otherwise this also fuels irregular migration. On the external dimension, enhanced cooperation with countries of origin and transit, but on those aspects that are in their interest. Trade, investment, economic cooperation, cooperation on vocational training, so on and so forth. We need to establish better and more stable political relations so that it's really in the interest of our partner countries to cooperate and that they maintain this cooperation. It has been mentioned before, but it's extremely important, the elements that are outside the scope of migration policy as such: promotion of stability, of conflict resolution, of peace building, let go of ill-prepared interventions like in Libya or Syria, reconsider arms trade. All this fuels irregular migration. Final remark.
Final remark. Thank you very much.
Is all of this realistic? Well, I think the new pact on migration and asylum contains all those elements already. It goes exactly in this direction. Now it's a question of commitment, of funds, of a lot of funds, of perseverance, of patience, and of communication. And then the EU and the member states really can deliver on such an agenda. Thank you.
Thank you much, Martin. And as the next speaker, Michael, as the director of DG Home, you are overseeing the Commission's work on migration and asylum. Why do you think that previous migration pact by the Commission was met with resistance, and which parts were improved in the current migration pact presented in 2020? I will also ask you to please, I know it's a difficult question, but please keep it brief and sweet. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me and see me. Thank you for the invitation. I have the impossible task because I can't answer your question and go into all the details. The pact is enormously broad, complex, and interlinked because it's by nature the subject is like that. So why did we not make progress previously? Well, I think because we've got some challenges that we face. No one member state experiences migration in the same way. Some member states continue to face challenges at the external border in terms of external border management. Others must cope with large-scale irregular arrivals by land or by sea, or have overpopulated reception centres, and others still are faced with the phenomenon of unauthorised movements of migrants. So member states have different concerns, and all these concerns we need to be recognised, acknowledged, and addressed. And it's a difficult subject. I don't need to say that. You all know that. It's politically very sensitive in different ways in different member states. It's regularly topping the list of priority issues. I saw today in Germany, opinion poll showed how important it was to get progress on the pact. In our earlier proposal, we hit this a kind of blockage, I would say, in finding a way through in the council. With the parliament, we made progress. Parliament took a position, but in the council, I think the previous proposals were causing difficulty in terms of on some fundamental issues to find a way through. So we came forward with a new pact, and this was what the new commission decided to do, was to look at this again, to do extensive outreach with the member states, with the European Parliament, and to indeed to follow a realistic and pragmatic approach. I mean, this was something I'm glad the previous speaker recognized this and recognized the different elements there. We have put out a vision of how we move ahead. I would just add to the list of issues of what's essential to move forward. We need compromise. We also need to find compromise between the different parties. We follow here a step-by-step approach, coming back to one of the earlier speakers as well, introducing this subject of integration at EU level. One could imagine a different model of dealing with migration, but we have the world we have, and therefore we take the step-by-step approach here, a pragmatic, a realistic approach I think the Commission has taken, facing up to the challenges. Also, in terms of the complexity, trying to join things better together. We have, as I said, different ways of looking at things. We have different areas of policy making that can be looked at separately, but everything is interconnected. So you have asylum, you have return, you have the internal policy, you have the external policy. And what we have tried to do with our new pact is to build the bridges and break down the silos between these policy areas. We recognize that a comprehensive approach is needed, and we recognize that an integrated policy making approach is needed to bring the different elements together. And that's reflected in terms of building or overcoming loopholes that we identified, for example, between asylum and return procedures. So we try to streamline and stress the interconnectedness of the different policies. Also, internal policy, external policy. External policy dimension is very important, and it needs to link up with the internal policy making. So this is something that we've looked at. I also should mention very quickly an issue that is very important, of course, which is to find the way ahead on the fair sharing of responsibility and solidarity. Previously, the balance in this area, we saw that this was the most difficult issue, I would say, in the Council between the member states. So here we've looked for, again, building on this integrated approach, this comprehensive approach, a wider range of solidarity measures. For example, in the area of solidarity in the field of return, which is very important, I think, in terms of the responsibility it brings in terms of migration management. So what can other member states do? What can the Union do to help more in this area? Solidarity can come in then, therefore, in different shapes and sizes. It must be useful. So with this extra flexibility in terms of solidarity modalities, we also look to ensure safeguards and guarantees that the solidarity is really useful still for the member state that you're trying to help. And the future discussion in this area will be a lively one, I'm sure of that, a difficult one, but we're convinced that we need to move forward in this pragmatic way also in that subject. Just a word also on legal pathways. This is very important. In terms of legal migration, the EU competence is more limited. We share this more with the member states. It's up to the member states to determine the amounts of legal migration. But there are important elements that we see here in terms of the legal pathways. We've made progress recently on the blue card, which is excellent news. And we will come forward later in the year with a skills and talent package to develop this further. Also on legal pathways, we mustn't forget the humanitarian legal pathways. On resettlement programs, very important. We're not building a fortress here in Europe. We need to uphold our values, and that also includes humanitarian support. I think I've probably run out of time, and
yes,
also I'm
thank
afraid
you very much.
I have to leave you at 2 o'clock. I'm afraid. I'm not trying to be rude. I just have another speaking engagement.
Thank you very much for your time and for this very well-prepared overview. Next, I would like to bring the national view in. Tobias, you are the head of migration strategy for the Austrian Federal Ministry of Interior. We heard the word realistic, pragmatic, compromise, solidarity. Where, from a national perspective, do you see the way forward?
Well, thank you very much, and also already good afternoon to everybody. I will try to cut short on some of the points that have been mentioned by others. There seems to be, by and large, broad agreement that there's a large geopolitical dimension to migration. And I think this is the first thing that we need to keep in mind, because in our understanding, this is the first problem why we're not advancing, because we don't have a system in place that is suitable for this new reality of global migration, which is clearly different to the migration and asylum challenges we faced in the last century. I think it's fair to say that we are all still in the middle of a migration crisis, because migration and asylum movements worldwide, sooner or later, will affect us, as could be seen in the migration crisis 2015-16 at the EU-Turkish border last spring, or just recently in Ceuta at the Moroccan-Spanish border. So the biggest problem for us at this stage is that we are still more or less trying to solve those newly emerging challenges with the instruments and ideas from the past, and no real change of paradigm has taken place. Just to give you one example, as we all say, well, the globalized dimension of migration is very important. Around 80% of displaced populations live in the global south. Still, according to research that we have, for every $135 spent on an asylum seeker in Europe, only $1 is being spent in those countries. So I think here we really need a change of mind and look at a global system that really helps provide protection for the many, not just the few. And I think this is also very important for the European Union as one of the leading states in designing the future of our world, that we not only look at ourselves, but that we create an international system that works and looks at the challenge from the root on. The second problem that we see at the moment, why we're not really moving forward, is that the narrative, the predominant narrative within the Union, is still by and large wrong. We do not agree that it's mainly those member states at the external border who are most under pressure, but it's actually Northern and Central European states who bear the biggest burden. Just to give you the example of Austria, we have granted protection status in more than 130,000 cases, and we have received more applications for international protection than 14 other member states combined since 2015. So the predominant picture of burden being only on some states at the external border, in our point of view, is completely wrong. So if we don't get these assumptions correct, then I think also the answers are very hard to get right. To give credit as to what Michael just explained, the new pact is a step in the right direction. I think we are moving forward slowly, but we're moving in the right direction. But I think much more needs to be done, and we are, of course, ready to do so. If I may be a bit more precise and focus on the three most crucial dimensions that we see. One would be the external dimension, of course. And I think this is a field that is slowly but steadily emerging. But what we are, for example, we still cannot see what exactly are the three or the main goals of EU's external migration policy. For Austria, it's quite clear. It's about preventing illegal migration. It's about expanding protection space in regions of origin, and it's ensuring returns. I cannot see this commitment on a European level yet. And I think it's very important that we agree on those goals and then really pursue them with vigor. Let me get to the second dimension I wanted to touch upon, and this is external borders.
Maybe very briefly, if you allow me, because time is running, but thank you very much.
I try to be very brief. Of course, we cannot only rely on external partners, but we need to secure our own borders. This is very crucial because, as we can see in the cases of Turkey, Morocco, and others, third countries use migration as an instrument to exert pressure on us. So the EU must be in a position to really stop migration at its borders. And the third point that I wanted to mention very quickly is on the common European asylum system, the internal system. We are in complete agreement that solidarity is a key component, but it should be focused on really migration management and solving the problem, not only shifting it. And there we see that relocation has divided the member states, is used by some as an excuse not to act. And so we are spending a lot of energy on a concept that will be very hard to fly instead of really focusing on the reform of the system. So if I may conclude, sorry for cutting it very short, with 4 concrete recommendations. I think we need to develop a really strong external migration policy as a European Union. 2, we need to rectify the problems at the external borders. It must be the EU who controls who comes in and who not. We need to re-establish trust in the system, and this also means for us enforcing the existing acquis. And 4th, and finally, we need to prove that we are jointly able to really act, not only to procrastinate. For example, there are legal acts like Eurodac, like the Asylum Agency, that could be adopted quite quickly, and I think we need to achieve progress jointly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this intervention. And the last on the panel is Gudrun. In your article, Migration as a Leitmotiv for Change, you describe the increasing complexity of global change leading to a sort of super diversity, which we need to embrace in order to manage it. Can you maybe give us just a very brief and short taste of what you base your central sentence on?
Thank you very much. Do you hear me? Do you see me? Probably don't. Yeah. Do you hear me? Sure, but you don't see me. No problem. I do put make a point with the terminus superdiversity. The term was coined by Wörterweg, an analyst, a scientist, to make us aware that this is the state, and the situation we're in today is different to what we've had before. And every era, every time has its own drivers of migration, sure enough. But the 21st century is something different in terms of dynamics, in terms of distances. It's practically every country in the world that is involved in migration. We have various actors. We have global labor markets, we have global education systems, we have global enterprises, and all that has got migration as an important element in it. As a result, I do believe it is not very easy to control, in parentheses, migration. From what I heard so far, I believe it was a bit too simplistic. Because the result of this increasing dynamic and diversity, if not super diversity, is that every country has now multicultural, most diverse societies in terms of skills, competences, gender, belief systems, languages, and the migration routes that have been taken are different, the legal statuses are different, and all that means that we have to take a very close look at migrants and migration, not just migration, also migrants. Because if we are not careful, there is a danger that every country that has migrants in the country are becoming socially fragmented. And this is a challenge, social cohesion as a result of policy failure. And policy failure, in my sense, means that we are forgetting that migration automatically implies integration. And integration has been mentioned before already, but what does it really mean? Give equal opportunities, equal chances to this enormous diversity, be it in the various structures of our societies, the education system, the labor market, the political system, etc. And if we don't manage that, I'm afraid we're going to import disintegration into our countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all your contributions, also for your contributions, Gudrun. And of course, with this limited amount of time, we can only scratch the surface, and there's so much more to discuss and speak about. But the second panel is waiting impatiently, I'm sure. That's why I hand over to my colleague, Clemen.
Thank you very much, Carmen. It's been very fascinating to hear so many important points in a very succinct way. And we will hopefully try to do the same in this panel. My name is Clemen Jumer, and I come from the European Parliamentary Research Service, which, as mentioned by the Vice President of the European Parliament, Othmar Karas, answers questions to members of the European Parliament and prepares analysis on EU policy with the motto of empowering through research. We try to do independent, objective, and authoritative research. And I personally had a Linking the Levels unit, which is reaching out to governmental organizations across the EU, including on the national level, but also over 500 regions, and to also almost 100,000 municipalities that we have in the EU. COR is one of our key partners in this, and this event today being organized and co-hosted in this way together is a great example of this. We have a very interesting panel. We have had already a good introduction into the migration topics. We looked at various aspects of asylum, economic migration, internal market implications, etc. In this panel, we will go down, so to say, and focus on the levels that actually implement most of the EU policy. We will look for the perspective of those levels, especially regional and local, and examples of good practice, as well as talk about integration in this context. So we have a distinguished panel of 4 speakers here from both the EPRS and the COR, as well as from academia, professors and researchers from different parts of Europe. And what I will do is I will really ask you to be short. If you do 4 minutes, it would be great. And I will have to interrupt you if you go longer, as Carmen skillfully did in the previous panel. But I also invite everybody who is here following the discussion to write in the chat, and I will try to integrate any of your questions you may have into the points that I will ask to the panelists. And let me just go ahead and start. I will start with Anita Orov, who is an expert from the European Parliamentary Research Service on asylum policies and integration. She has published extensively on this. Just less than 10 days ago, a publication on labor market integration of asylum seekers and refugees. A briefing came out. A link is also available in the program, and we'll share it in the chat. Perhaps, Anita, you are an expert in this field, and you know a lot about these issues. Following up on the discussion we have had already, you have heard throughout the day, could you comment a bit on the discussion and reflect on the European action plan that the EC has presented very briefly? Does it sufficiently involve the local and regional levels, would you say?
Thank you, Clemen. Can everyone hear me? It's fine? Okay, hello to everyone. Okay, so one idea that I would want to pick up from the previous panel is that there is skepticism towards migration everywhere. And when we talk about integration policy, this is something that we always have to take into consideration. At the same time, integration is something that is necessarily a two-way process. So it's a process of adaptation for the migrants themselves, but also for the host society. So this is something that needs to be kept in mind. But also it cuts through many policy areas and aspects of migrants' lives. So it is difficult to measure and define. And it's also a long-term process. So the action plans and their outcomes are also difficult to assess as they are presented, but I'll do my best. And I would say about the new action plan that was presented only in November 2020, and whether it goes far enough in involving the regional and local levels, in that some elements do look promising. because I think the Commission has taken on board some recommendations made by local and regional authorities and civil society organizations during the open consultation that preceded the publication of the proposal. And as specific examples, I could mention removing the specific reference to the resident status of third country nationals, focusing more on migrant women in integration, and this also goes in line with the new gender equality strategy, and putting more emphasis on multi-level governance that builds on previous experiences and also sharing best practices. But as some less positive aspects, some criticism has been expressed regarding the unclear wording, which does not make exactly clear whether EU funding would also be available to undocumented migrants. And altogether, the recommendations on EU funding for the recovery plan have considered to be quite limited and vague. But what would also be useful now would be to complement the practical implementation at local and regional level by some more concrete commitments taken by national governments. And this could be done, for instance, at council meetings, and it might help to create a stronger political momentum for integration and inclusion, which I find is all the more important now that the pandemic has left migrants even more vulnerable than they were before. And to borrow the expression used by Professor Pelinka in the beginning of the webinar, this would also show that we are not the political dwarf, that we can find political commitment together. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much for being concrete and concise, Anita. Let me go directly on to Bert Kubi, who's from the Committee of Regions, head of unit there of the Commission for Citizenship, Governance, Institutional and External Relations, CIVEX as we call it. What do you think about these comments? You have a lot of long-term experience in the both COR and wider in the EU institutions. Could you give us some examples maybe, and maybe comment on what Anita was saying? How realistic is it that some of these things would be taken up, as well as give us some examples on why is it important to work with the regions and cities, in your opinion, in your experience?
Yes, thanks very much, Clement, for giving me the opportunity here. And indeed, I can see from practice and from what we've seen that really cities and regions have a key role in integration, because obviously this is where people live. That's where people integrate into neighborhoods, into communities, and regions and cities, of course, in varying degrees and with differences across the countries. They have key competences in this respect to integration, and of course this is linked to social services, welfare services like housing, food, and also the questions of health, of course. But it's also about skills, education, and the labor market, and there are indeed many examples that prove or that show, that demonstrate these examples, and I come in a while to this. Maybe to say why migrants play that important roles is that indeed they counter, and it was mentioned, these negative trends that we have across Europe of demography. I mean, they bring into communities, into societies and into labor markets, I mean, those skills that are in shortage there, they allow to uphold certain services, and like schools, for instance. But not only that, they bring in also skills and innovation, and they bring on also diversity. Now, Professor Busjäger said it may have become more difficult during the pandemic, but at the same time, we've also seen, especially during the pandemic, how important migrants are and people with a migrant background in essential workers' jobs as doctors, nurses, etc. I mean, we've seen all of them, and so where did we see all these examples while recognizing that role of cities and regions. This Committee of the Regions set up in 2019 this Cities and Regions for Integration Network, which brings together all these good practices examples. And maybe just to name two quickly, city of Solna in Sweden, which is a very good example of successful integration. It's, by the way, also the most business-friendly city municipality in Sweden, and I'm sure that helps. But they brought together these two aspects of a tailor-made and a targeted approach with migrants, and that link to labor market and the business community. So it's a dialogue with migrants, it's coaching, it's education, it's language training, but it's really a tailored approach to prepare, generally in 2 years, migrants for the labor market. And it's this network of businesses that work with the municipality, and that then can draw upon these people with skills that are so needed in that community. So that's one example, which is also driven. Let's be clear about the philosophy of rather giving jobs than income support. That is of course another example with unaccompanied minors in Catalonia. Again, it's also a personal targeted approach of these different minors that live even outside in the streets, to approach them, to have a dialogue, and then to link them up with volunteers that are ready to help them face sometimes very essential things of society, and also bring them gradually to schooling. So all of this shows, to us at least, that there are many good examples for integration, for successful integration, but also to promote a narrative of solidarity, it was mentioned, and to counter disinformation. Now, we also heard already Mr. Speich refer to our partnership with the Commission, the integration partnership. So we're very active there as well in the action plan on integration and inclusion. And an example of that is that in the same week, this Friday, we have another workshop, a webinar on setting up local integration strategies, and we're working with DG Home in this, but also with associations like CPMR, Eurocities AER, and also in other contexts, the CMR, which are very active in this. So just this as a quick overview, and of course, I'm happy to come in later if necessary.
Thank you very much, Bert. We also shared in the chat the CRS Cities and Regions for Integration link that you mentioned, and thanks for all the concrete examples that you gave us. Now, let's move on to Südtirol, where we have a researcher, Verena Wisthaler, from the Institute for Minority Rights at EURAC Research Center in Bozen, Bolzano, that is with us from the ground, so to say. You have also in the book co-authored one of the chapters and analyzed immigration integration policy in Südtirol, and there you say that the specific situation of Südtirol can offer important lessons to be learned by other regions in Europe, especially in terms of divergence of priorities, sensitivities between national and local levels. Could you tell us a bit about this?
Sure, thank you very much, Clement. But before answering your question, let me briefly thank the organizers of this webinar and the editors of the book that we are discussing today. So I would like to use my intervention to discuss 3 points. First, I would like to highlight the specific role of the regional level in the MLG framework, which is very often forgotten. Second, I show how regions in Europe are different, and I talk about minority regions such as South Tyrol. And finally, I point to some roles that regions can take over in immigrant integration and position them in the MLG framework. So I start with my first point, and I might sound like preaching to the already converted, but very often there's a concentration of research, but also of networks and initiatives positioning cities as pragmatic and the key actors in immigrant integration. But I argue that there is also the meso level of government, the regions, which are getting increasingly active in the field in Europe, but worldwide. Look at the US, where immigration and integration legislation activity of the states is really impressive. But also in European regions, many European regions have their own integration laws. In Italy, all but 2 have specific integration laws. And as has been said, the rescaling of social policy to the subnational level has turned immigrant integration into a major competency of the regions in Europe. As a consequence, we see that regional variation within one country is extremely broad. A Muslim woman in Ticino, for example, is very much restricted in her daily life and cannot wear a burqa, which is possible and easy for her in nearby Uri or Wallis. Or that access to healthcare for undocumented persons varies greatly between Tuscany and Lombardy, two regions within the same country in Italy. So regional variation eventually also exceeds international variation, and this matters. So regions matter, and regional policies matter and make a difference for migrants' lives. We have published a special issue on that issue, and we argue that what drives regions to engage with immigration integration policies is not primarily numbers, is not the demography, and is not the economic situation, but is regional politics. And we have shown that party politics at the regional level matters, and regions governed by left-wing parties or coalitions with left-wing parties involved emerge as particularly active, providing social rights and citizenship to immigrants. But we also show that regions engage particularly with the socio-economic dimension of immigrant integration, that is, access to healthcare, access to regional labor market, and social inclusion. Regions are not concerned with the grand narratives of national identity and symbolic belonging. But there is one exception, and that is minority regions. So there are many regions with subnational mobilizations seeking for independence, regions characterized by cultural and linguistic differences than the majority of the state they are in. Regions like Catalonia, Basque Country, Wales, and South Tyrol. And here I am at the book chapter. And those minority regions, such as South Tyrol, they face a particular challenge once confronted with immigration, namely how to reconcile traditional diversity stemming from national minorities and new diversity stemming from migration. And those regions do not engage with economic immigrant integration primarily, but they focus on cultural issues. Why so? Because they strongly connect immigrant integration policies with identity politics and with nation building. The Basque Country, for example, argues that diversity is the new marker of Basqueness, or South Tyrol, in contrast, is arguing to be a bilingual territory at the crossroad between North and South, but nevertheless, South Tyrol is hesitating to accept migration to become a defining part of its identity. So the question is, how much diversity is acceptable in a minority region? And in a way, those minority regions are laboratories for what happens in Europe in general, namely laboratories for how to deal with different sources of diversity and different sources of inequality at the same place at the same time. This brings me now to my final point, where I want to bring all regions, minority regions, and let's call them ordinary ones, into a MLG framework, multi-governance framework. And I can talk you through some examples and show that regions have very different roles. They can become policy laboratories, inspiring policymaking at other governmental levels. Region-to-center learning, for example, occurs in Spain, when in 1993, Catalonia issued the first plan on immigrant integration, and 1 year later, the Spanish government followed. Or region-to-region policy learning occurs in Belgium, when Wallonia followed the Flemish example and adopted a more assimilative cultural integration policy. Regions, they can also be gap fillers. Again, the example of Belgium, there is no federal immigrant integration policy, but there are the two regional ones, Wallonian and Flemish one. Regions can act as successful mediators between different levels of government within one state. An example from the UK. The UK government in Westminster wouldn't finance education for children waiting in detention centres for the processing of their asylum claims, which de facto excludes those children from the right to education. The city of Cardiff, where there's a large detention centre, demanded that those children be granted access to education immediately in light of their future development. But Cardiff didn't have any financing, so the region of Wales stepped in and provided partial funding to overcome that conflict between city and central level. Border regions even have the potential to mediate between nation states, as again my own example of South Tyrol within the Euro region, Tyrol, South Tyrol, Trentino shows. Once the Italian-Austrian border was very much contested during the migration crisis in early 2016, South Tyrol mediated between Italy and Austria and prevented in that way the closing of borders in response to the increasing migration of people from south to north. Finally, regions emerge as alternative loci of belonging. They offer what we call a regional citizenship. Again, the example from Wales, which is positioning itself as the first nation of sanctuary, coordinating between city or local level initiatives, local governments and NGOs and civil society movements, coordinating all those initiatives into one regional approach, the Welsh approach to sanctuary. And this, of course, shapes people's attitudes and behavior, turning them in the end into reactive regional citizens, which is surely all to the good. And with this, I would like to finish, namely pointing once more to the important role that the regions play, and not only looking at the city level, in immigrant integration and the various implications this has then for MLG. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Verena, and we're getting a lot of different examples in a short manner. We also have some questions in the chat, and some don't really relate to this panel. They relate to a broader question, also previous panel. So I ask different colleagues to have a look and maybe follow up on these. There is one from Maya that does look into the role of local and regional authorities as well as COR in working with subnational authorities in third countries in relation to border management. So maybe somebody can also say something on this. In fact, we have Christoph Rensprecht, who is coming from the Institute for Sociology as a professor and doctor of sociology there, University of Vienna. Maybe you can comment a bit on this as well. You also wrote an article about cities as key actors of integration, and you argue that while nation states close their borders, cities may be more pragmatic and may want to keep their gates open by creating welcoming and inclusive communities. We've seen from Verena how the different policies really have a different results in a quite striking fashion. So what is your, what would you say about the city's perspective in this respect, please?
Yeah, thank you, Clement. I hope you can hear me. And okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. And thank you also, Peter and Christian, for your initiative to publish the book and to organize the webinar. Let me start. What I will say now fits perfectly in what already had been said, especially Verena's talk. Let me state with the argument that from a multi-level governance perspective, the local indeed had become a new strategic relevance. And this does not only refer to the fact that implementation takes place locally, but even more to the fact that the local itself gains autonomy as an actor. This particularly refers to cities as arrival places, as we know from Sanders and other authors, who attract migration and who serve as hubs of mobility, flows of people and goods. However, let me state some, maybe four, maybe even contradictory points why we should not only focus more on cities, but develop also a new understanding of local and urban levels, so to say. First one, integration is shaped by national, supranational regulations, border regime, etc., but takes place locally, where people live and institutions act concretely. Housing, health, labor, education, social services, poverty reduction. We know from research on integration indicators that the friendliness of local people, the possibility to participate in local community is from perspectives of people who are migrating, key issues of integration. Second, cities are formed by migration historically and today, and shaped by mobility, and have a, and this is very important, a tacit, a historical knowledge how to manage migration and diversity and mobility. This is, of course, not a conflict-free remembrance or his past, but conflicts can be solved on the place. The local serves, as Verena said, as laboratories for social innovation. Informal solutions can take place, but also there's place for institutional learnings, which is very, very important. Third one, today local levels, cities, etc., are in contradiction with national strategies to regulate and reduce migration flows. This creates new alliances. Local levels are networking horizontally with other cities. We already you mentioned and put it in the chat, but there's urban innovation activities, URB Act, urban cities, and inclusive cities, and so. But at the same time, they build new alliances vertically. So, for example, European Union is supporting local regional levels, sometimes even by getting contradiction with national interests. This also, and this is important, requires new capacities, skills, competences on local levels, the capacity to work horizontally and vertically in inter and transdisciplinary and transsectoral way. And fourth, and this is maybe the most important point, the relevance of transnational and transsectoral networks corresponds with the fact that cities are hubs of flows of people and good. However, this also means that the logics of integrations from a local urban perspective differ to the understanding and the logic from nation and state perspectives. People are not only super diverse, they are also more and more multi-colloquially, multinationally integrated. And this requires innovation. That means, take the example access to social services, or take the example of citizenship. That's why, for example, the debate on urban citizenship becomes more and more a key issue. If people are moving around, are integrated in 2 or 3 or 4 places, and require equal access to services and, of course, to participate in the environment. So thank you very much. This was my statement.
Thank you very much, Christoph, and thanks to everybody. I'm happy that we were able to create quite some interaction as well. Also in the chat, you have different links to the projects Verena mentioned, also from DG Home, that is collecting data on regional integration policies, etc. Please have a look. And we did not forget about Harald, Miguel, and Joan with your comments and questions. We will follow up, and thanks also to Maya for her question. I have a pleasure to give back the floor now to Christian Sodam, who is in fact the person who initiated, gave the initiative for this conference and invited us to cooperate. And I thank him also from the side of the European Parliamentary Research Service for this. Thank you very much. I think there is maybe a problem with the connection at the moment from Christian. I know he was here the whole time, as we could see him, but he will probably come back in a moment. I don't know if anybody else from the panel that just spoke would like to have any other comments on each other, perhaps in this very short manner. This would be the time for it. And if you do, we don't have a plan, so you just go ahead and come in. I will also share in the link in the chat the link to the app where you can all have a look at various publications of the European Parliamentary Research Service in order to see and read them as they go, covering all aspects of EU policy, including migration. So please go ahead, panelists, if you would like to make another contribution.
Well, if I may, I would like just to add, as I said before, and I was posting this very interesting project into the chat. It's called Regions and Regions for Migration. Yes, and they are collecting data to create an indicator like the MIPEX indicator, which you are for sure all familiar with. But the project is also trying to establish networks among regions, because as we all know, there are many networks, there are many initiatives between cities, but there is a lack of those cooperation and those moments of learning from each other between regions. So I really appreciate that project, and in that way I would also like to probably stress the importance of those initiatives, which also the Committee of the Region could take up as an idea of fostering, creating those initiatives between regions, so that there is also an exchange between the different regions. And of course, there's then also a learning from each other and for an exchange of best practices among the regions, which would be really important also to deal with that topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Verena. Thank you for these conclusive remarks from our panel. I think it's true, networks are very important, and I think this conference shows that we are creating networks between each other on all different levels, and that's a great thing. But now the floor is yours, Christian, as you have been, as I said before, the person who initiated, gave us all the invitation to cooperate and to have a few closing remarks. We can see you very well.
Okay, can you also hear me? Because I have
also
connection problems.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me? I had connection problems, so I'm back on. Thank you very, very much, Clement. And thank you all for participating in this webinar. I made some notes. I go very quickly through them. My first remark would be, many speakers said, migration is there to stay. It will not go away. So it doesn't make sense to neglect it or to just avoid discussion about it. We have done that many years. Many member states have done it. Some still are in this modus. It doesn't help not to look at the problem. We all have to face it. It will stay with us. That's the first remark, which some leaders in Europe should really take very closely in their policy development strategies. Second, it was said our union is an unfinished federation, and we have to keep to work on it because we are by far not there. What has been said, we need stronger competencies in the external policy fields in order to tackle the roots of migration, the reasons of migration, but we also need stronger competencies when it comes to our internal decision-making process. And Mr. Karas said it at the very beginning, the conference on the future of Europe is an excellent moment to tackle these questions. We will have to take this up. The deadlock situations in which we have been for years, this is the moment that we also discuss about institutional questions in this respect. Third point, Europe is not without success. It has been said by many speakers. We focus very much on things which do not work, but there are many things which have been done by Europe so far, and they are working, be it in the asylum, be it in integration policies or others. There is, though, and I think Mr. Hoffman said it, there is this temptation to follow the populists and to go into the populist trap. And migration is an ideal subject for going in that trap. So this is also something we have to very much bring to the knowledge of everybody, that Europe is not without success, as it is very often portrayed. And for example, Michael Schotter also showed that we are moving forward slowly but progressively in the legal pathways, the blue card and other initiatives which have been taken by the European Union and which are working. He also made one statement which is important that we keep in our minds. If we want to move forward together, we need to have a spirit of compromise. The deadlock situations which we faced in the past were also due to the fact that some member states thought their interests are not at all taken on board and they were not ready to go towards a compromise, also out of ideological reasons. So the question for the new pact to be implemented will always be also that we sell to member states, is their interest covered? And there, Mr. Molander said it. We need to look at the narratives. We need to see what is the narrative which can fly in a member state. For Austria, and he said it, it just does not fly always to repeat that you have to support Italy, Spain, or Greece because they are so heavily burdened. It's true, but the interest of Austria is that their burdens are seen. The interest of Hungary is that their situation is seen. And I think this is a lesson which we have to learn from this debate, that we have to find ways that the narratives which will be able to make the policy fly, that they are also accepted, and also that we use them in those member states, and not only tell the Austrians, you have to help the Italians, you have to help the Spanish, or the other way around. We have to find the right narratives when we want to find pathways to compromise. Then let me come to integration. The debate has shown for me, and also in the book it was very clear, this is maybe the best example why we need multi-level governance, and why the local and the regional level is so important. Why? Bert Kubi said it. These regions have the key competences. They have the key competences in their hands: education, health, social affairs, many others. So we have to look at them in order to learn what has to be done to make it a success. And they have not been lazy over the last years. It has been said also by Bert, but also then by Verena and also by Professor Reinbrecht. We have so many solutions at local and regional level across our continent, which have shown already that it can work. Now, what can we do at European level? We can learn from each other. We can benchmark these experiences. It is not always needed that we reinvent the wheel everywhere in Europe, but let's find those examples, and this is what is done also in the network Bert was talking about, and which is done together with the European Commission. Let's find the examples and let's adapt them for other regions. Let us make regions, as it was said, the laboratories for solutions in Europe, which they are indeed. They have already found many solutions. Let me conclude. I think that this subject will need all of us, be it academics, be it politicians, be it a normal citizen everywhere. It is a subject which we will only be able to tackle in a successful way if we all work together at the different levels, if we understand the situation in different member states and look also at the situation of others, look at the situation at the different levels, and not try to find the one key which will solve this problem. There is not the one key which will solve this problem. There is, though, the possibility that we, in a way which is an interactive way, be it in a political, multi-level governance way, but also concretely in integration on the ground, in dialogue with between citizens and immigrants and migrants, there is the possibility when we work together that we can make it happen. And this is the hope Ottmar Karas was talking about at the very beginning. There is always hope in the end, which needs our efforts, which needs our conviction, our commitment. This was also said, it is about commitment. Anita was talking about the commitments of member states in the council. We need commitment everywhere, and then I think we can also have it. Let's have this hope, let's have this commitment. Thank you. Peter, over to you.
To add. And I have only to thank all the people who have contributed to this webinar, and my warmest thanks for the contributions and for the excellent cooperation. I think the event was a very useful insight in the various topics of migration. Thank you all, and stay healthy. And we will have a follow-up and of the topic, and yes, we keep you involved. Thank you.